pleasure to be here. When I was talking to Liz about this presentation, we talked about calling it Why Do Diversity? And that's a question that a lot of companies face because diversity always seems to be a little bit of a lower priority than some of the other really big issues that we face in our business. But I thought that I would begin with, before we talk about why we should do it, a little bit of a definition of diversity and also talk about why it sometimes feels so hard to do. So the first thing is, what is diversity? To say that a company or an organization wants to become more diverse is sort of meaningless, because diversity is only meaningful if you define what vectors you want to become more diverse in. Do we want to become more diverse in terms of gender? Do we want to become more diverse in terms of sexual orientation? Do we want to become more diverse in terms of people of different abilities within the organization? Do we want to become more diverse along racial or cultural lines? And unless we define what those vectors are, then to just say that we want to be more diverse is not very meaningful. The second thing is, diversity feels really hard to do. Not hard to do in that it's like impossible and intractable if you focus on it, but hard to do sort of like flossing your teeth every day is hard to do. There's so many other things that would be nicer to do than flossing your teeth, or that are more of a priority, like cleaning up the kitchen or going to bed at night. So diversity is a bit like that when you think about doing it in an organization. It often feels like it's sort of this sidebar to the organization's goals. And as long as it feels like sort of a sidebar, it's pretty easy to gloss over. So what makes it kind of tough? Well, I think there's three things that make it a bit tough to do. The first is that a lot of the things that we are trying to overcome when we talk about making organizations more diverse are really about historical inequities. And that means that when we want to have a more diverse organization along gender lines or racial lines, we have to go out and do legwork to find those people. They don't just come to us. Boeing discovered this when they started having initiatives around diversity, and they said, well, we just don't have any diversity candidates that apply. And so it really is an extra effort to seek out different vectors of diversity than what has historically been there, because it's a systems problem. The second thing is, sometimes when we start embarking on having a more diverse and inclusive organization along racial or gender lines, it actually is a little bit less efficient, because it means we don't have an organization where everybody thinks like us and makes all the same assumptions and does things all the same way. And when you think about it, doing things all the same way can be really efficient in the short term. Intel, as a company who is the microchip processing company, they have an expression for this in their chip fabs. They call it copy exactly. And in order to get really high productivity levels, they make all their fabs exactly the same. That's great when you're trying to produce a lot of compliant microchips. It's not as good when you're trying to solve really complex and ambiguous problems like most of our organizations are today. The third thing is that when we are trying to include people who are different from what has historically been normative in our organizations, the people in the organization and the people we are trying to include have a different perspective on the problem. People who have always been part of the normative dominant group, they think that what they do is normal and that everybody else looks at problems and thinks about things and thinks about diversity just like they do. You often hear Caucasian people saying, well, I'm not racist. I don't understand why people of color think I'm racist because I'm not racist. And the people of color say, but there's systemic racism everywhere. And I wondered for years, why is there this dichotomy between what the dominant group and the subordinated group perceive as what the issues are and what the challenges are and what the barriers are? And I once heard this woman, Angela Park, speak, who had a great answer to this, which is that the people in the subordinated group, whether it's women or people of color or differently abled people or gay, lesbian, and bisexual people, they have to spend a lot of energy and thought trying to figure out how to fit into the dominant group. So a whole lot of their consciousness is about how do I fit in and how do I belong. That means that when things happen that are systemically exclusive to them, they perceive it as looming larger. Whereas the people in the dominant group who never had to think that much about how to fit in, for them, they're only spending 2% of their brain space on how to fit in and most of their brain space on the problem at hand. And so that really, for me, has helped understand why sometimes when we're talking about barriers to inclusion, the people who are being systemically excluded feel that those barriers are very big, even when the people in the dominant group are not feeling like it. And if we want to have organizations that are inclusive, we need to also hear the perspective of why people are not coming to those organizations. So That leads me to this question of why would we do it? If it's kind of like flossing our teeth and we're not going to have healthy gums at the end, why do diversity? Why do this work to kind of put ourselves into the heads of other people and then recruit these people to our organizations and make sure that they stay? That's a really important piece of it. So I think there's 3 really good reasons to do this. The first reason is access to talent. I think that if we have organizations that only look for a little piece of the talent pool, there might be other people out there that are more talented than some of our less talented people that could come into our organization and really enhance its performance. If we're willing to look at the whole of the people out there, including people who don't look and feel like others, like those who have traditionally been inside our organizations, we have a strategic advantage in recruiting people because we can get really skilled and talented people into our organizations, and that will make the organization perform better. We had an interesting situation a few years ago on the board of NAOP, which is a commercial real estate association, which I'm part of, where somebody said, you know, the board of NAOP just isn't filled with traditional business leaders anymore. And this was like after a few years of trying to recruit more women and younger professionals to the board. And this was kind of like an older, more traditional person. And he said, this organization just doesn't have any real estate leaders on the board anymore. And I thought that was really interesting because he saw less of himself on the board. But it didn't mean that there weren't leaders in the real estate community on the board. There were lots of leaders. They just didn't look like him. The converse is also true. NAOP is able to attract people to be members to the organization because prospective members see people who look like them on the board of NAOP. And I'll tell you, I think twice about joining organizations where I don't see women in leadership positions outside of HR because otherwise I think, well, that organization just doesn't have a use for what I could bring to the table. I also think it's really important to think about the value of diversity in attracting clients. So if you are able to attract talent to your organization that includes underrepresented groups like people of color or women or LGBT people or even differently abled people, your clients who have a connection to that subordinated group are going to want to do business with you when they see somebody who looks like them in your team that's pitching the work. This is a really big thing. I have this situation all the time where we're evaluating hiring somebody and I'll see a team that is all people who don't look like me, and it doesn't mean that I don't like them or think that they're good or want to hire them if they're a really competent team. But the human sense of empathy is such that people are excited to work with people that are like them. And so that's kind of why we wound up with this problem in the first place. But it also means that as our client base gets more diverse, we need to make sure that our talented team includes lots of different faces on it. So that's the first piece. That's the access to talent piece. The second piece, and this is maybe even more important, is that having diversity within organizations has really, really strongly been correlated with better performance. You know, one of the places that this has been studied tremendously is with respect to gender. And I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the research that's been done on this. First of all, people have studied the impact of women on boards of companies. And one study by Catalyst in 2007 showed that on average, companies with the highest percentage of women board directors outperformed those with the least by 53%. They also outperformed on sales by 42%, and their return on invested capital was higher by 66%. So these are really statistically significant items. Lest you think that there are just like 1 or 2 studies by organizations who promote women who show this, Credit Suisse Research Institute from the bank Credit Suisse in 2012 studied publicly traded companies and found that over the previous 6 years, the share prices of companies with at least one woman on the board outperformed those with no women on the board. Interestingly, the correlation was weaker when the economy was booming from 2005 to 2007, but with the recession from 2008 to 2012, the stock prices of companies with at least one female board member were on average 26% higher than for companies with no female board members. Pepperdine University has also studied this and studied that Fortune 500 firms found that companies that promoted women most often made 18 to 69% more in profits than median companies in their industries. Now, this is not the whole universe of research, but I do think that when there are studies that show that having this kind of diversity within organizations really helps the bottom line, it behooves us to think about how to do that. Not only how to attract women in this particular case, but also how to retain them. One of the things that sort of comes to mind when you hear statistics like this is, why is this happening? What is it that makes a diverse organization work better, come to better results? And one of the things that has been studied quite a bit around cultural and ethnic diversity is that people who are of different cultural backgrounds understand questions of risk and choice in different ways. There are different orientations toward how important it is to individualize choices versus to think about group outcomes and choices, and to consider how the group's methodology of choosing can lead to a better outcome. And this is something that is a body of research that Sienna Yengar, who is a researcher from the south of the US, has done a lot of work on in understanding how people from different cultural backgrounds relate to choices. And that's important if you think about the fact that our companies face all kinds of ambiguous choices every day, and if we can bring a lot more different orientation to the decision making, we can come to better decisions. Going back to the gender piece, which has been studied quite a bit, one of the areas also where gender has been studied with respect to choice is around managing risk. There's a group of ex-traders from Merrill Lynch who studied how companies manage risk and how men and women traders in particular manage risk. And they found, this is a company called Financial Skills, we found that men take more risks than women. That would be fine if they also made more money, but they don't. Hesketh said it was inevitable they would. In our experience, everyone so the other thing they did is they tested whether people were breaking rules. So they had some rules set up in this trading simulation that they put about 1,000 people through, and they had some rules about when you could do it and how you could do it. And they said they thought it was probably pretty likely that there'd be some rule breaking, but they said, in our experience, everyone breaks the rules. It's just a question of how often. What was notable, however, was that male traders broke the rules 2.5 times as much as women. That's a huge statistical deviation, Hesketh says. So this is not meant to malign men, absolutely not. It's only to say that different genders and different cultures have different orientations around risk and choice, and that if we put all the people who are all the same in a room together, all doing the same thing, they might come to an answer very quickly, but it might not be the most well thought out and balanced answer in the world. And when you think about what you want in your organizations, we do want to be quick. We do want to be nimble. There's a price to pay for exploring how other people think, but there's also tremendous value and upside to wrapping our heads around the way that other people think and taking the time to do it, particularly in our most challenging decisions. There's a wonderful book that came out in 2013 that is about also how we innovate, which is another question in companies, right? It's not about just making choices, but it's also about coming up with new ideas and new innovations and beating the competition. And there's a book by Victor Huang and Greg Horowitz called The Rainforest that looks at what they call innovation ecosystems. One of the things they talk about is, if you think back to that Intel example, there's a lot of companies that have a production mentality, which is how do we make more of that output? It's almost a byproduct of the agricultural revolution, if you think about it. When you're in agriculture, you want to get rid of the weeds and really focus all the Earth's productive capacity on creating more volume of crops, whether it's wheat or corn or soybeans or milk. And so, it's the cows that make the milk, but you get it. So one of the things that's interesting in that production orientation is that we tend to pare out all the things that are extraneous. We tend to get rid of the things that don't fit in or that slow us down or that are different. Horowitz and Huang call those the weeds. Now what's really interesting is that a lot of times our best innovation actually comes from the weeds. And our resilience to when the outside world changes, whether that's a change in economic conditions or a change in the weather, comes from having things that are not so tightly optimized around one particular outcome. So if you think about it, one of the things that they found in the Brazilian rainforest, which is one of the places where there's tremendous biodiversity, or if you will, lots of weeds, is that that's a place where people are continuing to find new plants that can lead to sort of new medical innovations, that can find new cures for diseases, and part of what's able to do that is the tremendous biodiversity in that rainforest. Likewise, in our organizations, if we can cultivate differences of idea, differences of opinion, different people, it makes us more resilient to when the circumstances change. An example of a company that really tries to cultivate this is Google. They let their engineers spend 20% of their time on stuff that's not related to the bottom line. They don't do that because it's kind of a nice thing to do. They do it because they really want a proliferation of weeds and other ideas that are not judged based on ROI, that are not held to the test of how right is this for today, but that can blossom into things that could spur the company forward and give it a competitive advantage tomorrow. I think that cultivating diversity within an organization is absolutely a way to get to better performance through this idea of blossoming and innovation. The last thing I'll say is, so we talked about why does having a diverse organization give you access to talent? We talked about why does it help your organization perform better? But I would also say that cultivating diversity in an organization really allows the people in that organization to tap into the full potential of what it means to be human. And I'll explain a little bit about what I mean about that. I started out my career working in banking. I worked for Royal Bank of Canada, which is the largest Canadian bank, and I actually worked on a trading floor, which makes me interested in statistics about how people trade. I was 23 or 24 years old, and I wore a suit to work every day for the first time, and I buttoned it up, and I did all the right things, and I tried to fit into this huge trading floor with 400 screaming people on it. But I realized pretty quickly that I was the only person who rode my bike to work. And I was the only person who brought my lunch to work. And I was one of like 10 women out of the 400 people at the trading floor at that time. And it was really apparent to me that in lots of practical, but also lots of cultural ways, it didn't really belong there. And it wasn't because I couldn't do the work. It was because I was having to bring in a very thin and narrow version of myself into work. There were all these things about who I was that I couldn't talk about with the people that I worked with. And I realized after a couple of years of doing that, that wasn't a very fulfilling way to go about living my life. And that I had to find a place where, and I've talked about this before, where I could bring my whole self to work. Because if I could bring my whole self to work, then I didn't just excel on the things that were other people's metrics, but I could bring all the parts of AP that are cool and interesting and different and wacky, and maybe some of those things would be really useful to the company in a way that was unique to me. And so then I would have the excitement of bringing myself, and the company would have the value that I had brought these pieces that no one else on the team had. But in order to do that, we need a place where people who come to work feel like they can bring the pieces of themselves. And so when we do diversity as a company, even though we're identifying these vectors of diversity that we want, whether it's gender or more people of color or more other kinds of cultural diversity or LGBT diversity or ability diversity, at the same time that we create a culture that is open to all those people, we also create a culture that is open to all the differences that maybe straight white men have that they wouldn't otherwise share. And that is really important, that everyone in the organization, whether they're a member of an identified minority or not, whether you specifically recruited them because they were going to help one of your vectors, doesn't matter. Everybody in the organization can bring their whole self to work. And I think that is a super healthy thing for an organization, and I think it's a really healthy thing for us if where we spend most of our time can be a place where we can fulfill our own humanity. And so I'll leave you with that thought, which is that unlike brushing your teeth, where really in the long run, when you're 82, you're going to have great gums, I think that if we can embrace diversity within our organizations today, and make it a priority and justify it on ROI because it's going to improve our performance, we can also make ourselves and our peers a lot more happier and fulfilled. Thanks.